The neighborhood looked like something out of a real estate brochure. Pristine lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and streets that gleamed under the afternoon sun. On paper it was ideal. In reality it was a ticking powder keg. We had just moved into what we thought was our dream home, a modest house tucked in the corner of a suburban enclave. The previous owners had left it spotless, the paint still fresh, the garden meticulously maintained. Everything screamed welcome home, but the welcome had an unexpected caveat. As soon as we unpacked the last box, the first signs of trouble appeared. It wasn't the other neighbors, who mostly waved politely from across the street, but the woman who lived 3 doors down. Everyone called her HOA Karen, an unofficial title, but one she wore like a badge of honor. From the moment she spotted us unloading, her posture was rigid, her gaze sharp, as if she was auditing every step we took. She introduced herself with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and almost immediately, she launched into a detailed explanation of the neighborhood rules. Not the kind you'd expect in a homeowners association pamphlet. These were rules she had personally invented. She explained the HOA membership fee, the mandatory social events, and the rigid aesthetic standards. The color of our welcome mat, the type of mailbox, and the exact height our hedge could reach. We had considered joining, but the fees were exorbitant and the rules, frankly, invasive. My wife and I politely declined, emphasizing that we were happy to maintain our property responsibly without formal membership. That's when the atmosphere shifted. Her smile vanished, replaced by a glare that could cut glass. She began listing the consequences of refusing. Fines, legal actions, and most disturbingly, the possibility of police involvement. First it sounded like a bluff. Who calls the cops over a garden gnome or an unapproved mailbox? But HOA Karen wasn't bluffing. Within a week, we found ourselves face to face with an officer she had summoned. He wasn't hostile, but he was bewildered by the complaint. HOA Karen had framed it as a civil disturbance, an accusation that my wife and I were deliberately defying neighborhood rules and causing tension. The officer asked for details, we explained our side, and he left shaking his head. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Karen escalated the situation, filing a formal report and documenting every trivial infraction she could find. A slightly overgrown bush, a recycling bin left out for an extra hour, a wind chime that didn't conform to her color standards. Days turned into weeks, and our lives began revolving around her arbitrary rules. Every errant leaf or out-of-place patio chair felt like a trigger for confrontation. She would appear unannounced, clipboard in hand, taking pictures of our property and comparing them to her self-imposed standards. Our mail began to include letters from the HOA attorney, sternly worded notices demanding compliance. Friends started advising us to tread carefully, warning that HOA Karen had a reputation for weaponizing her authority. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was a psychological war. Then came the moment that changed everything. Karen, ever vigilant, decided to conduct a neighborhood verification. She claimed she needed to confirm our identities for official records, citing a clause from her HOA charter that we had never seen. When we asked for proof of her authority, she insisted on seeing our personal identification first. My wife handed over her driver's license, and I offered mine as well, thinking this would satisfy the ritualistic formality. But when we suggested she show her federal ID to validate her own authority, she froze. Her confident posture crumbled, the clipboard slipping from her hands. For the first time, HOA Karen had no answer, no script, no prepared response. She stared at us in silence, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. It was a quiet victory, subtle but monumental. The power dynamic shifted in that single moment. The woman who had dictated the neighborhood with an iron fist suddenly appeared human, uncertain and vulnerable. We didn't gloat. We simply returned her gaze calmly and closed the door behind us. Yet the war wasn't over, far from it. Karen's obsession only grew, her tactics becoming more creative and insidious. But for that brief moment, we had reminded her that authority requires accountability, and even self-appointed enforcers have limits. As night fell over the cul-de-sac, our porch light casting long shadows across the lawn, we realized that this neighborhood wasn't going to be the idyllic retreat we had imagined. Every interaction, every glance, every subtle maneuver mattered now. And HOA Karen, frozen at her own federal ID, was already plotting her next move. We knew the confrontation would escalate. There was no turning back. The next chapter would reveal just how far HOA Karen would go when her control was challenged, and the lengths she would take to assert dominance over the people she deemed outsiders. After that first confrontation, the neighborhood's polished veneer seemed to crack. On the surface, lawns remained immaculate and houses pristine, but beneath that calm, Karen's scrutiny intensified. She didn't let the incident with her federal ID pass quietly. Every step we took became fodder for her meticulous documentation, every small action a potential infraction in her eyes. The subtle war she waged against us escalated, and it was clear this wasn't just about rules, it was personal. We quickly realized that HOA Karen's influence ran deep. She had allies, neighbors who were eager to please, or perhaps feared repercussions if they didn't. They would drop off anonymous notes, subtle warnings disguised as friendly advice, suggesting minor corrections to our property, hinting that non-compliance could be costly. At first, we ignored them, assuming passive neighbors would eventually tire of her antics. But the notes became more pointed, the visits more frequent, and her interference started creeping into aspects of our lives beyond the house. One morning, we returned from a grocery run to find a brightly colored flyer pinned to our door, announcing a neighborhood meeting. The wording was formal, almost legalistic, yet dripping with underlying menace. Attendance was not optional in HOA Karen's world. It was mandatory in her mind. She would preside over the event, outlining the duties of residents, the importance of conformity, and the consequences of dissent. She painted herself as the guardian of neighborhood integrity, a self-proclaimed protector whose authority could not be questioned. At the meeting, her power play was on full display. She spoke with confidence, citing obscure clauses in the HOA charter, referencing rules that didn't seem to exist elsewhere, and scrutinizing every attendee. Some neighbors nodded nervously, while others exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear she had cultivated an environment of fear and compliance. And then, without naming us directly, she pivoted to a thinly veiled warning. Outsiders or non-members who refused to conform would be watched, reported, and held accountable. Every word was a calculated threat, every gesture an assertion of dominance. The following week, her tactics escalated in more subtle ways. We began receiving what appeared to be official correspondence. Letters, emails, even text messages that looked like formal notices, warning us of supposed violations. The claims were trivial, a misplaced flower pot, an uneven garden stone, but the tone was aggressive. There was a method to it. She was creating a record, documenting everything in a way that could later be presented as evidence of defiance. It wasn't just harassment. It was an attempt to establish a narrative where we were the problem, the intruders in her meticulously ordered world. Despite the mounting pressure, my wife and I remained calm and calculated. We documented every encounter, every letter, and every interaction. Photos, timestamps, and digital logs became our armor. It was a game of chess, and while HOA Karen moved aggressively, we stayed strategic. We realized that escalation would be met with countermeasures, that patience and prudence were our strongest allies. Still, the emotional toll was significant. The constant scrutiny, the passive-aggressive notes, and the daily monitoring of our property created an undercurrent of stress we couldn't ignore. Then came the most audacious move yet. HOA Karen, emboldened by her perceived authority, decided to challenge our independence in an unexpected way. One evening, she appeared at our front door, flanked by two neighbors she had rallied to her cause. She demanded entry into our home, citing vague rules about inspections and neighborhood safety. The implication was clear. She wanted to assert dominance inside our private space, to make her presence undeniable. But when we calmly asked for proof of legal authority and identification, reminding her of the federal ID incident, she hesitated. The confidence she once wielded like a weapon faltered, and her allies shifted uncomfortably. It was a moment of suspended tension, but HOA Karen was nothing if not persistent. Though her bravado had faltered momentarily, she regrouped quickly, shifting tactics from overt confrontation to covert surveillance. Over the following days, we noticed unusual activity: neighbors lingering near our driveway, small cameras installed in common areas, and even casual questions from strangers posing as new residents. It became clear that Karen's obsession with control had evolved into something more calculated, a campaign to monitor and intimidate rather than simply enforce rules. As we navigated this new reality, we began to see the full extent of HOA Karen's methods. She wasn't just a neighbor with rigid standards. She was a master manipulator of systems, using paperwork, intimidation, and social pressure to bend the neighborhood to her will. But the federal ID incident had left a crack in her armor. We understood that she relied on the illusion of unquestioned authority, and whenever that illusion was challenged, she faltered. That knowledge became our quiet leverage in a battle that had no clear end in sight. The chapter closed with a sense that the next move could come from anywhere: an unexpected letter, a surprise inspection, or even a public confrontation at a community event. HOA Karen's next escalation would test our patience, strategy, and nerve in ways we hadn't yet imagined. But one thing was certain: the fight was far from over, and the rules of engagement were about to change in dramatic fashion. As the dust settles on the latest confrontation, one question remains hanging over the neighborhood, and over us. How far should someone go to enforce rules? When does vigilance cross into obsession? And most importantly, what would you do if you were in our shoes? We've laid out the events, the letters, the visits, the intimidation, and even the standoff over a federal ID. Now it's your turn. Should we keep standing our ground, or is there a smarter way to handle HOA tyranny? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you would navigate a situation like this. Because in communities like this, every voice matters, and sometimes your advice can tip the balance.